Welcome back to the Restaurant Growth Show podcast. Today's guest has been featured in the New York Times and the Globe and Mail, and his column Fed has been widely acclaimed. He has a background as a cook and a restaurant consultant, and he once sat down to eat everything on the Tim Hortons menu, filmed it, and lived to talk about it. I definitely want to get into that aspect. Let's all give a warm welcome to food reporter and author Corey Mintz. Corey, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So first things first, I just mentioned in the intro, went to your website. I saw the video on Tim Hortons. I know this was a while ago. What happened there? What was going on?
For a period, I seem to be the go-to Tim Hortons critic for Acclaimed's magazine. I think succession of one editor just said, "Hey, well, I don't remember what the first one was, but they said, well, Corey, write whatever it was about some new Tim Hortons thing." And I guess they were happy with the results. And then I think over a few years, I wrote like a half a dozen pieces, and they were all about Tim Hortons. And I never pitched one of them. They were always them contacting me. So someone contacted me and said, "Would you eat the whole menu?" And of course I said, "Sure, that sounds like fun." And I did over the course of an afternoon and brought home a whole collection of little Tim Hortons packages with 2 bites taken out of them, like dozens of things for my pregnant wife. And she has them and said, "Get these out of that."
Now, was it inspired by the Super Size Me, the movie that went viral years before?
I don't remember. It would have been like summer of 2019. I don't remember. I think it was an editor saying like, "Hey, people do these videos where they eat all these food, all the food on the menu." And I said like, "That seems wasteful. Can we find a way to do it that doesn't, have me taking 2 bites and throwing food in the trash?" And she said, "Yeah, we'll make sure we've got people in the office who will eat the rest." I don't think that was true. I think they threw it all out.
And the overall impression, I mean, I did watch the video, but for people watching at home, what was the overall impression? I have my personal opinions, and they're a little scathing of Tim Hortons if they're ever.
I mean, this is 5 years ago now. From what I remember is like if I were driving on a highway now and the only option was Tim Hortons, I would go, "You know what? I can get that breakfast biscuit sandwich and a coconut donut." The toasted coconut donut was the one donut I felt was good, and a black coffee, and I'll be okay. Everything else was, I remember this chili that was like so sugar. I was like, how much sugar do you think you need to add to this chili to camouflage its taste? It seemed, it was inedible.
Sugar and chili are just a couple of things that should never go together. Jose, what do you say?
For me, actually, I went to your website and I checked out the videos, and the one with the kids was the one that pulled me like just to watch it all, and it was quite funny and cute, especially the little girl that ate the broccoli.
I think the challenge at the time was someone saying, "I can't get my kids to eat vegetables." I said, "Well, give me a shot. At least I can't. I'm not going to guarantee success, but maybe it'd be fun because I just want to see. Now I'm remembering. I think I wanted to really test the theory that I knew something. I'd read a study that said like the more kids are involved with the production of food, the growing of food, the cooking of food, the setting the table, the more likely they are to have an adventurous palate. So what if I made 3 vegetable dishes in an hour, but I got the kids to help me with chopping, stirring, whatever it was. And so they were all doing it. And I found them all more receptive to at least trying it. Whereas I don't think that's true with my daughter, because sometimes she'll get very excited. She wants to help me. She stirs and all these things, and then I say, "Great, well, let's taste it." And she goes, "Oh, no."
No, of course not. No, absolutely not. Yes. Thanks for the invitation. I'm going to pass.
I'll take what I can get at this. I'm like almost counting down to what hopefully will happen when I've been told maybe she'll be like 6 or 7 and she'll discover other foods, but she's a plain noodles and buttered toast kind of girl.
Yeah, that's no surprise. Hopefully, some Velveeta cheese, cheese on anything.
If you run out of cheese, it's a real sort of Sam and Diane kind of relationship with her.
Interesting. So, Corey, in our last episode, Jose and I reviewed your Business Insider article, Dining Out is about to look a lot different, in which you made the claim restaurants need to evolve to survive, but you're going to hate what they've got in mind. What are people going to hate and why?
Well, I think people hate change with something they feel they understand, like something you like garbage pickup, like we're going to change your garbage pickup from Thursday mornings to Friday mornings. Like there may be a good reason for it or whatever the reason is. We're going to do it bi-weekly, But if it's enough ingrained in people's lives, they feel like they know how it works. They don't want to hear that it's changing. You know, in this supermarket, instead of queuing up to the left of this cash register, we're going to queue up to the right. What? How dare you? This is my civil rights. And I think when it comes to restaurants, there's so much of the way they work and the way that we interact with them that we don't question because, you know, as we grow up, our hopefully parents take us out to eat and we learn how these places work and how we interact with them, and we just stop questioning that. And I actually had an amazing afternoon with my daughter on Fridays. I pick her up from school and I take her to Shorty's, this local pizza place, and a swim, and we spent 3 hours there last week. She finished her slice of pizza, 45 minutes of dancing, and then she just got really fascinated by the kitchen. And for once, you know, I was able to actually questions as a dad who, you know, like, I don't know why the sky is blue. You know, I don't usually have all the answers, but because of my restaurant background, I had all the answers. And it was really great explaining, here's why they're doing it was in the middle of the afternoon. Here's why they're doing their prep. Here's why they're stacking the food, or the chits are coming out. Here's why they're organizing them left to right. And she was really fascinated by that. I think most people, for them not growing up in a restaurant family or working in restaurants, it's about you go out, person comes to your table, they ask you want to eat, you choose something from a little book filled with different dishes. You tell them, they bring it to you, and then at the end, you pay for your meal, and you decide, based on your interpretation of their job performance, how much they should be compensated. And this is full service dining, obviously very different from the QSR sector or, you know, high-end restaurants where people interactively. But this is the common restaurant experience, and the common restaurant hasn't really been working, you know, for the last 4 or 5 years. Everyone's familiar with the pandemic disruption, but just on a profitability level, on a manageability level, you know, the staffing crisis, call it that has become a public conversation in recent years. You know, I've been writing about that since 2015. This has been a pot that has been slowly simmering, coming to a boil. The differences in the hostility that restaurants have encountered from some diners, and the bottom line, the profitability, you know, the way that rising labor costs, food costs have just shrunk that classic 30% labor costs, 30% food costs, 30% fixed costs, that old paradigm in an era where the average profit margin is about 3 to 5%. Well, then those old numbers really aren't holding. And so that old model really doesn't hold. Never mind all of my lefty, altruistic feelings about how people should be treated. It's just not profitable to run a restaurant the old way. And, you know, we've seen some progress in culture in recent years. We've seen progress in, you know, the old archetype of the yelling chef who demands that everything be perfect every time, or they yell at you. You know, that started to shift away. Employees started to stand up for their rights. That's great, but it's like we've moved an inch, but we're still expecting people to come and work 12 to 14-hour days, to be perfect all the time. The tipping model doesn't make any sense. And, you know, in my work, I've written yards and miles of paper about tipping, and I always love talking about tipping, but it's not just that. And so I've been looking lately, and I'm starting to sort of do the legwork for a new book, and the idea of like other models in hospitality that I see people using to both treat their staff better and run a more sustainable business. And the two of those things, they're intertwined, because staff better is about staff retention. It's about doing something about that 75% turnover rate. And the restaurants that I see doing this host of things mentioned in that article, dynamic pricing being one of them, open book management, profit sharing, switching from tipping to service fees. I didn't get in that article to worker ownership, which is another aspect, but it was, you know, already an overstuffed piece. The people I see doing these things, they're holding on to their staff. That's the important message I want people to walk away.
And it's one of those things that I keep repeating, reminding our listeners that a happy employee means a happy customer, you know, an environment. Think about it as a corporation, and a technology, embrace it. Don't be scared. It's everywhere. And it's in terms of adoption and change and everything. So on that note, let's talk about Wendy's recent announcement to implement dynamic pricing.
The Wendy's debacle.
The Wendy's debacle.
But yeah, this Wendy's debacle, Corey. I'll let Jose finish his question.
Like they were like, oh, retracting. No, it's in 2025. Anyway, so what's your take on the announcement?
Well, I heard 3 words I want to explore there. Debacle, I think, is right on. Announcement and flip-flop, I'm going to disagree with. And I think this is where they've really embarrassed themselves. Announcement, because part of why this was such a failure for them was they didn't announce this. This was their CEO talking on an earnings call, which is not a private space. It's a public space, whether or not any reporter repeats your words. Rather than, I think, being aware that dynamic pricing, which is one of a host of ideas, tech-based ideas that they were talking about, hey, we're going to introduce these over the years, rather than introduce this as, hey, this is potentially controversial, or at the very least, very prone to being misunderstood. Let's really, really brainstorm and strategize our messaging around how we're going to announce this. Instead, he just listed it as one of many things.
Yeah.
And understandably, people listening, reporters, writers, pick that up and use the not accurate, but much more widely understood and much more widely felt term, surge pricing. The difference, to my understanding, being dynamic pricing is the ability to raise and lower prices based on demand fluctuation, whereas surge pricing is only raising prices based on demand. And most people are familiar with it almost exclusively through, the Uber Lyft platforms where prices can double or triple. We're not talking about like adding on 10 or 20%. We're talking about like clear gouging. So rather than an announcement, he just kind of mentioned it, not realizing that he was setting off a firecracker in his mouth. And I don't blame people for getting it wrong. People don't know what dynamic pricing, or rather, people don't know the terminology. Everybody knows it. Everyone who's ever booked a hotel room or a flight or a concert ticket who said, well, if you buy it at this time or closer to the date, you're going to pay, more or less. Like everyone gets that. But it is so rarely used in the restaurant sector that those words don't mean anything. And the words surge pricing pressed all of everybody's buttons. And to the second part, I don't know that they flip-flopped so much as they just did a little bit of crisis, not even crisis comms. They just did like some sort of damage control and really just massaged their message, because they didn't say, we're not using dynamic pricing. They said, the thing that people are accusing of, we're not doing that thing. We would never do that thing. But I don't have the quote in front of me, but as we roll out our digital menu boards, they'll enable us to provide savings for customers. And so they're clearly going to do this, but they revealed this in a totally unsuccessful way. And I can only assume that at that top level, he was just not versed at like how the public would interpret this. What a volatile subject he was just walking backwards into.
Debacle confirmed. Yes, when your CEO is not prepped and aware of the hot button terms like surge, like dynamic pricing, that needs to be carefully disseminated, especially with press there. Yeah, absolute debacle. We have Google alerts set up, Jose and I, for dynamic pricing because it's periodically in the press. And the last week, especially since this Wendy's debacle, has just our Google alerts have just been blowing up with 10 articles every couple of hours.
Oh yeah, I mean, you reached out to me before this happened because, hey, you wrote an article that mentioned dynamic pricing. Oh, how nice. And then it became an actual national news story.
It's on all of the late night talk shows. It was Jimmy Kimmel. It was, all of and they're all doing skits on it and jokes about it. It is absolutely blown up.
Yeah, it's crazy. I think, when Jimmy Kimmel came out with that first, and there was the concern. It's like, okay, this is what's in the collective imagery. And okay, fair enough. But then when this happens and then everybody just goes and runs with it, it just made the educational phase of this new technology a little bit more heavy.
That's right. Well, now you've got to work against this narrative. So how does this position you now in a company that creates software to facilitate dynamic pricing in restaurants?
Yeah, this has been top of mind at each of our scrums, since this happened. And I'm of the mind that this is a teachable moment. This is a good thing. There has been a visceral reaction. I don't know if you're on Reddit, but Reddit has just exploded with comments about what's happening. And the majority of the comments they're talking about, my favorite burger from my favorite restaurant that may not be Wendy's or whatever is going to cost, dollars more at a particular time of day. And what we know is that dynamic pricing in the restaurant industry involves cents, not dollars, marginal increases and decreases, and it fluctuates, obviously. But from our company standpoint, this is a teachable moment. This is an opportunity for us to have this conversation and educate not just restaurateurs, franchise owners, franchisees, but the customers themselves to realize that there are as many promotional prices as there are demand increases. Going back to your original point, Corey, restaurants are having a really difficult time turning a profit and surviving. And it has just as much to do with their profit margins as it does the labor shortage. So this is a tool for the average restaurant to use to look at their pricing on a more regular basis that doesn't involve gouging. It involves increasing traffic during off-peak hours and adding a little bit of a buffer to their bottom line. And look, restaurants are a fabric of our society. They are near and dear to every single one of us. And we do not want to see our favorite restaurants go under. Why not utilize a tool like dynamic pricing in a meaningful way, in a subtle way, to help our favorite restaurants survive and thrive?
Can I ask you about the practicality of that? Because and I think I tried to explain this as succinctly as I could in that Business Insider piece, the idea that, the very few people that I saw using dynamic in their restaurants were doing it expressly to increase traffic on, those early weekdays. They're saying, yeah, we're packed every Saturday, Sunday. That's not the problem. I'm trying to even out my staffing, manage my inventory better. And by filling those seats on Monday, Tuesday, this is a revenue neutral way of doing that, but it makes the business more solid. And I was dealing with people who had enough other altruistic business initiatives going on that I take their word for it, The other thing they said was because they're all tasting menu restaurants.
Right.
And so they were saying this is just more straightforward and manageable to say, the Friday, Saturday menu is X and the weekday menu is X minus whatever, 15, 20%. And that's how I incentivize that traffic. But doing it a la carte, they all kind of said, I'm not saying it's impossible, but it just seems too complicated. I can't get my head around it. Because you, to my understanding, you've been beta testing this with a couple QSRs, right? So how does the simplicity of sort of having a weekday and a weekend price for a tasting menu translate to the much more nuanced having a longer a la carte menu?
So there's two ways of seeing this. I think that the easiest perspective is that the sort of, let's say, blanket approach would be that it's an ongoing or on-demand costing optimization of the menu at any given time, right? This is happening fractions of a second, but taking into consideration the data that is coming from all these other sources, including and mainly the POS to read all the historical, put a forecasting towards a particular type of strategy, then you can see that in that feedback loop, that's where the secret sauce is to actually generate and make a decision on what a strategy could be. The machine learning lives in that cycle. Now, to see it at the detail level, let's say you were to choose the top five performing items. You wouldn't be doing it with everything. But between the five, there will be including modifiers and other pieces that have pricing, that adds, that will continually be measuring that performance and that demand and the levels of supply, the cost of things, and other pieces like weather or locally.
That would, just so I understand, that would adjust in real time throughout the day on an item by item basis.
Within a parameters that are under the control and the definition of the strategy, right? So peak hours. Okay, an increase. Off hours, decrease. And which ones, at what rate? That piece is where the dynamic part of the dynamic pricing is that it changes and it adapts based on that.
If it's that subtle, how does it incentivize during the off hours? Like if it's something that the diner doesn't necessarily notice, then how does it push?
Very good question.
That is a great question. And I'll jump in here, Jose. With our platform, it's not just enough to lower prices during off-peak hours. There's a feature within our platform that pushes out marketing communications across social, SMS, and email that notifies that restaurant's followers that there is promotional pricing for specific items. Those are going to work best for obviously more high volume, high margin items. But when we knock 10 to 15% off of one of those items during an off-peak hour or day, then we're going to see a spike in transactions. And that's the real value of a model like this.
That's what we're targeting with the transparency, bring some transparency to it.
Yeah.
So what about, because the transparency to me is, same thing with service fees in place of tipping, which seems to work better than pricing, service inclusive pricing, and the studies show that. And everyone seems to want to go that way except for Massachusetts and New York State, where you can't do that. But in both those cases, with that and with dynamic pricing, what seems to me integral is that you explain it upfront to the consumer, or you're going to face the backlash. We've seen, I think a good example of that is the shrinkflation conversation. It's, all these companies have been doing this for decades. That's a standard thing, right? Make the Snickers bar a little bit better to keep the price stable. But people have become so aware of it lately, and people are loyal customers and they have social media, and they're like, I buy this bag of chips every week. It's whatever, 80 grams less. And they're going to take the picture and it shows up and then it's on CBC or whatever. And people are writing a story about it. If you are not upfront with how dynamic pricing works and how the customer is involved with it, how it relates to the business, don't you face the same type of discovery, the sort of gotcha moment of people going, I order for whatever, a burrito from this place every Tuesday at this time, and I just started noticing something, and I got all these screenshots.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I don't disagree, to be honest with you. This is mostly in the case of an in-store model where you sat down at your favorite restaurant, you ordered, your spaghetti and meatballs, the same as you do every single week. And then all of a sudden, 30 minutes later, your neighbor comes in, sits down at the table next to you, and gets a different price for the same spaghetti and meatballs. That's where dynamic pricing we haven't seen work very well in the short history. However, I can tell you for certain that the price you're paying for your favorite burger and fries on a third-party delivery platform will be different over 5 different times you order it. It's already happening. And that's without a solution like ours. Those prices are changing based on where you are, what restaurant you're ordering from, what platform you're using, what the local legislation is on third-party delivery platforms, what their service fee is. Those things are so fluid and changing so often that people actually don't even really realize that.
I follow you on that. And I know, from experience that people both either don't notice or don't care. They accept that's part of it. But of all the reasons you listed, day and time are not one of them, right? And nobody knows more than the regular customer, has that familiarity with what prices are. So yeah, I hear you on it's a totally different relationship in the restaurant where you would be aghast to hear that the table next to you is paying a different price, even though obviously we don't all announce our bills when they come. But I don't know. Well, you tell me. You're doing the testing right now on price elasticity, right? So do you see people noticing this, or what are your insights so far?
So far, there is little to no change in customer sentiment, small sample size. But again, this is about testing, and this is about marginal and incremental price changes. And you're not going to know unless you implement those changes. And so still early to say. And, like I mentioned in our email exchange, there are competitors that are running dynamic pricing with no complaints whatsoever from their customer base.
Toast is the obvious sort of name of competitor, but everyone is familiar with Toast. They're kind of the more prominent company, and I think dynamic pricing is not really their main focus, but it's something I know that Nick Kokonis is a big advocate of. Are there a number of other companies offering this?
Only a handful. It's early days. And again, this comes down to testing and being really, really mindful of a brand's customer base and really, really being careful with the increments of price and the items that are affected.
Yeah, I did a piece of work for a restaurant that wanted to eliminate tipping, and they said, we have our reasons, and I talked to him about the reasons. I was like, that's great, and he said, we just want to do it right. We don't want to do it and then have to walk it back. And so we worked on it, and it's great. That was my first consulting gig, and it was really satisfying. And along the way, I think a big concern of his was less customers and more staff, and talking with like how this would work, and wanted to make sure he was going to keep all his best people. But along the way, he was concerned about price elasticity and wanted to sort of conduct some research. And I said, and I spent the time to Google and learn about price elasticity and how you measure it. And ultimately, I was like, you run a barbecue place, right? Your barbecue's good. I know it's good. And I can get all the menus of all the local barbecue places and compare prices. So I did, I got started doing some price elasticity modeling. And basically I said, look, here's like a spreadsheet of your pricing and half rack of ribs and, a half pound of brisket and so on. And everyone that I can think of within the city. But ultimately, what's your institutional memory? Because I need some sales data to put into this. When have you raised prices? And he was off the top of his head, he was like, in 2016, we raised the price of this. In 2017, we raised the price of this. And I was like, what was the reaction? It was like, none. And I said, I think you want this number you want this number for emotional reasons. You want to just sort of trust that science is telling you that you're safe. But you kind of know what the market will bear in terms of your consumers. I think what's really going to matter is how you communicate this to them, and that you be honest. And he was. And now that we find ourselves having this like national conversation about dynamic pricing, I'm still of the mind that like, I think this can be used for good or evil. And all that really matters is that restaurants that use dynamic pricing are either incredibly transparent about it or are incredibly and successfully secretive about it. Obviously, I prefer the one to the other, but what do you think? Do you have to like be fully transparent, or do you really have to prevent people from finding out about this? Or is there a third version that I'm not seeing?
I mean, you bring up some really great points, and to be determined. Let's be honest. McDonald's, Chipotle, some other big brands, they're already doing it. And there's some backlash for McDonald's. They've raised their prices and they're sort of walking that back as well. But these brands have implemented dynamic pricing already. And they have yet to really make a statement, I guess you could say, but it's already happening, especially with digital boards, this new drive-through technology that is being experimented with. So I don't have the answer for you there, but what I do know is that restaurants need to look at their pricing more than once a year on average. And the margins are too thin. There needs to be some sort of strategy implemented when it comes to their pricing, and they need to be able to adapt to conditions outside of just demand, right? So this is one of those solutions. The communication with their customer base, it's got to be by the brand. I don't have the answer to that, and we're figuring that out as we go. I can tell you one thing, it's not how Wendy's did it.
Yeah, I mean, that's the easy answer to this week's news is this is they'll be teaching this in marketing classes. Like
Absolutely. Yeah.
To roll something out. How did McDonald's and Chipotle communicate this? Or is this simply something that customers are noticing now we're all aware that they're doing?
They just went ahead and did it. There were a handful of locations where McDonald's had been experimenting with AI drive-through technology, and there's some facial recognition technology where the algorithm would understand whether this was a return visitor, what this person would prefer according to their database. And so that digital board would be updated with specific items. Really wild stuff, or super futuristic stuff. And it's absolutely coming down the pipeline. That in itself is controversial with the facial recognition as you go through a drive-through. It's coming. It's coming. Like, these brands are experimenting with that. Chipotle, similarly, they rolled it out and they got a little bit too aggressive with their price increases, and there was some serious backlash with them. So if anything, we're learning from those brands, but again, it's early days. So I don't know, Jose, I'm sure you have an opinion on this.
Yeah, so I think that, I mean, one of the things that I enjoyed in one of the email exchanges was that the academic approach. And I think that because this is so new, it's the only way that really you can gather data that it's transferable and makes sense. So in our commitment, we have hypotheses when we test these things, and then we get results. And I am of the belief that, like you asked, 1, 2, or 3, that third option, I think that there may come a third option as we get closer to the horizon. Something that's going to come up where transparency and trust in these type of technologies will become just as a new thing that AI brings to us.
Well, your challenge along with the brands that you work with is to build that trust.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Again, it's elasticity, maybe not just price elasticity, it's customer behavior elasticity. It's how they're reacting to new technology, even though they're subject to it every single day. You go and you get gas, you're partaking in dynamic pricing, not to mention hotels, airlines, rideshare. It's all around us. And I don't want to use that as an excuse. Well, it's coming, just deal with it, because that's not the right approach. But we do know that restaurants need this type of a solution in order to survive. So yeah, early days, tough to say. It's a touchy subject.
Yeah, but a fascinating one. I love talking about it, and it's been a pleasure chatting with you both about it. Or tipping. Always love talking about tipping.
Tipping,
me too,
yeah.
both.
We've done a couple episodes on tipping, and it is just so controversial. Would love to have you back on the show, Corey, to talk specifically about tipping, because you obviously have done quite a bit of research and work with some businesses.
Not right for everybody, but for those who choose it, it can work out really well.
Yes,
I
absolutely.
definitely would love to talk about that.
Anytime.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah. So, Corey, now's your time to plug away. Where can restaurant operators, where can restaurateurs connect with you? What's your platform of choice?
I mean, I got a website, corymintz.ca. I go back and forth between the various social medias. I try to stay off Twitter, but you can never completely stay off Twitter. You gotta keep one toe in, but I rarely post there. All my contact information is on my website, corymintz.ca. And I'm gonna go now make a nice dinner that my daughter's not gonna touch.
Broccoli.
That's fantastic. Speaking of plugs, this podcast is sponsored by Dine Pricing, real-time restaurant profitability. Dine Pricing uses artificial intelligence to improve restaurant profitability by dynamically updating menus across digital channels like Uber Eats, DoorDash, and Grubhub. That's all the time we have for this episode. Thanks again to Corey Mintz for joining us. All of his contact information will be in the podcast description. Until next week, say goodbye, Jose.
Goodbye, Jose.
That's awesome, Corey. Thank you so much. I know we ran over time there, but man, it's a fascinating subject, and it's a real interesting time for restaurants and technology. It's kind of crazy.
It was my pleasure to go along with you. Happy to chat some other time. Jose, Gordon, thank you so much.
Awesome.
All right.
Thanks, Corey.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.